In addition to organizing our code into separate functions, we can also organize it into separate files. Now, Python systems for doing this are complex and varied, but we'll talk about just the basics here. So returning to our functions.py program, in which we wrote a bunch of functions that draw simple cat drawings. Let's say for the sake of argument, I have a program that I want to import these functions into, which is to say I want to use these functions, but I don't want to have to recreate them because they're far too complex. So I'll create a new file here, and I'll call it myprogram.py. Now, in order to access the code from our other file, all I have to do is say import and then the name of that file. So here it's called functions. Notice I don't include the extension, just the name of the file. The way this works is if there's another file in the same folder, so my program's here, functions is right next to it in the same directory on our system. In that case, Python will look locally to see is there any other files with this name, and if so, it will import them. In this case, it will take all the global attributes, so the functions that are defined and all the global variables, and it will bring them into this code. If there isn't a file with the same name, so if there wasn't a functions.py file next to myprogram.py, Python would then next look into its default folder, so wherever Python's installed on your system, and it would look through its built-in library, so random and math and all of those, to see if any of them are named this as well. So if you're creating a math library locally, it's going to hide the global one, which can be a potential source of error, so do be aware of that. So we have this new program. It's imported our other functions, so let's just use them. So as the simplest way, we've imported our functions. Now we can say from that library, which is called functions, we'll say dot, and then the cat. So the dot operator says, go into this module, which is a separate file, and find the name cat, the function cat, and then run it. Save our code. In this case, we'll say Python myprogram.py, and we'll get a drawing of a cat. I could also say functions.cat2 and then give it a face. Oh, if I typed it right, I could. I'll say functions.cat2 and then give it a face, and it runs both of them. Alternatively, if we only wanted one of those functions, so I could say from functions import cat2, if that was the only one that I wanted. And then all I have to do is just say cat2, because it takes this name and it puts it into the global namespace in the current file. Save our code and run it. Alternatively, if we want to import everything into the current file's namespace, we can just say from functions import star, and then I can just use all of the names as they're currently written without having to say functions dot and then whatever. Lastly, this is a bit of a Pythonism, but when we have all of our code organized as a procedural design, so everything's tucked away into a function, and we still have that call to main down at the bottom. So for the sake of argument, let's say cat here is our main function, and just ignore that there's anything below it. Normally we'd have code written like this. We'd have all of our functions defined, and then down at the bottom we would call the first one of them. In Python, the standard way to format this is to use the following sort of magic syntax. We'll say if name is equal to the string underscore underscore main underscore underscore, then we'll call cat. So this is sort of a Python magic word. Understanding it's a bit beyond the course, but what it's saying is if this file, the current file, our functions.py here, if this is the main file, that is, say, the file that was being executed at the command line, then we'll run this function as normal. Otherwise, don't do that, and let whoever's importing it use it however they want to. This lets us use files that can be used by other files, so imported into other files without running on their own when we import them. But it also still lets us run those files on their own if we want to use them as standalones. This is the standard way of using Python. The reason I bring it up is because if you go out into the wild and start looking at code, you're very likely going to see this line, if name equals main, and then usually underneath a call to main. In this case, we're calling cat as our main function, even though it's not really a main function here. But just to show you what the syntax is for this call. So what this means is if I go to, if I say Python functions.py, it will run that cat because name, which is a hidden variable built into Python, equals main. So this script is the file we called. But if I call myprogram.py, let's just change what happens so we can see a different result. So notice this doesn't call cat. If we run myprogram.py, different face here so we can see a clear difference. make this one smiley. There we go. If I run myprogram.py, it imports functions, but it doesn't execute this line. If I remove this line and try doing that, so we'll put this back in global, notice when we import the file, it runs the cat, and then when we actually execute it, it runs a second one. So going back to my program, which is what we ran, so we go myprogram.py, it says import everything. So it goes to functions, runs through all this, and at that point it sees cat and draws one of them. And now we're back at here, we've imported everything, we're ready to do our work. That's when we do our second cat. So by including these magic words here, so if name is equal to main, then run cat, that says if I'm running this from the command line, then do this statement. If I'm not running it from the command line, so if someone's importing this function, then just ignore this statement.